Interview with Shaykh Hamza Yusuf is being conducted by Haroon Sellers and brought to you by Deenport.com. Bismillah. The first question, could you tell us about your latest book project, The Purification of the Heart, which was recently released? How did this project come about, and why do you think it's so important?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The book, Purification of the Heart, actually came out of a series of lectures that I gave. It was a course that I gave several years ago in Hayward, California, and that resulted in a tape series that was produced called The Purification of the Heart. So that was the basis for the book. The book was based on those lectures. And it's basically a commentary of a poem that was written in Mauritania by a very well-known sheikh there. He wrote the book, according to him, Shaykh al-Yaqubi. He wrote the book based on the fact that he saw people studying fiqh and aqidah and becoming very well versed in the outward aspects of the religion to the neglect of their spiritual states. And he actually became very troubled by the fact that he would find people that were very well versed in arcane matters of fiqh and things that they would probably never use in their entire lifetime, but they were completely ignorant of the states of their heart. They were ignorant of the fact that they had pride, that they had anger, that they had envy, that they had lust, that they had greed, that they had covetousness, that they had extended hopes about the world, that they had miserliness. So what he did is that he began to look in all of the classical literature, particularly from the early people, Abu Talib al-Makki, who's very well known early scholar and wrote about the states of the heart, Imam al-Muhasibi, who was a companion of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and Imam al-Junayd, who, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, was an imam by consensus, and Imam al-Ghazali, who wrote 40 books and compiled them into one 4-volume or 5-volume work, which is called Ihya Ulum ad-Din, reviving the sciences of the religion. And that Ihya is composed of 40 books. The first half is mostly dealing with outward matters, although he always brings the secrets of fasting, the secrets of zakat, things. But they were dealing with the formal aspect of the religion. But the second half begins with the character of the Prophet in Book 20, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second half is concerning what he called al-muhlikat wal-munjiyat, those things that will destroy the soul and those things that will save the soul. And much of it centers around the heart, the human heart, based on the verse in the Quran, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. On the Day of Judgment, neither wealth nor children will avail a man. The only thing that will help him or save him is that he bring to God a sound heart. And so a sound heart, if you take that verse seriously, which I think Muslims should, it means that a sound heart is the whole purpose of our existence, that we're here actually to purify our hearts, to make our heart a vehicle for divine knowledge, for revelation, for manifestations of the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what the Christians call epiphanies. And so it's very important that people be aware of this, because according to Imam al-Ghazali, it's a fard ayn. It's actually an obligation on every person. It's not like, say, learning the rules of buying or selling. That's an obligation on people that are in commerce. But
right, well, I think that's an important point, that the spiritual science of Islam often seems to have been looked at nowadays as optional.
I think part of the problem is Muslims conflate these things with what's called tariqah, which is taking a sheikh, a spiritual master, and going on a path of what's called suluk. A lot of Muslims conflate these two things. They think they're the same, and they're not. And this is a science that was traditionally taught in madrasas, irrespective of whether somebody was in a tariqah or not. They're simply the sciences of the religion, and this is one of them. It's spiritual psychology, it's ethics. Traditionally it was called tasawwuf, but unfortunately tasawwuf today is so confused with a lot of things that have nothing to do with traditionally what scholars understood to be tasawwuf. I mean, tasawwuf as a science was never condemned by scholars. It's just a fact of Islam, and to say that it has been is just to indicate total ignorance. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah, who's often used as a bludgeon against these things, has a chapter, an entire book in his multi-volumed fatwa called Fatwa fi Tasawwuf. Fatwas about Tasawwuf. And Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah wrote an entire book, Madarij al-Sadiqeen, which is a commentary on a very famous text on Tasawwuf. So even these imams that are used as hammers against Tasawwuf, they themselves affirmed the science. What they recognized was that was in the science, like all sciences. In fiqh you have problems. There's opinions in fiqh that are completely unacceptable opinions. They're totally unacceptable. But they're still in the books. And the scholars still quote them. And you have in grammar unacceptable opinions. You have the Kufic school, the Basran school, they argue. Which one's the right one? Based on that, you come up with, according to our ulama, if you follow certain schools of grammar, you will actually interpret the Quran incorrectly. But those schools exist. Do we throw out all of grammar because some grammarians made mistakes in their understanding? And the same is true in Tawheed, which is the science of theology. There's gross errors in Tawheed. Jahm ibn Safwan, who was the head of the Jahmiyyah, was a theologian who said that the fire, that it comes to an end. And that opinion also was reiterated by other scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah. And I actually have an entire book defending his position. So a lot of Muslims don't know that. Ibn Taymiyyah said that the fire comes to an end. But he interpreted, he didn't say there wasn't khulud, khalidina fiha abada. He didn't say that it wasn't abad. But he had his linguistic interpretations of that. Well, the majority of ulama condemned them and said they're wrong. Does that mean we throw out everything Ibn Taymiyyah said because he made a mistake in something that was pointed out by other ulama? I mean, this is the type of simplistic and really ignorant reasoning that a lot of people have now out there, and they're not trained, they're not qualified to be discussing these things. And I'm not saying in any way that I'm, this is not my position. These are the positions of the ummah. This is just what I was taught. That's not something I invented and that's why it's really saddening for me. It's distressing to see the debates around these things that really should not be debated. If we want to discuss the problems within the science, then I agree that there are problems and it's important that they be pointed out. But it's also important that some of the problems are debatable. They're moot points. They're points that are insoluble because the scholars never came out with a definitive position on them. So that's important also to recognize that khilaf, difference of opinion in the ummah, is very real, it's very prevalent, and some khilaf are resolvable. There's preponderant positions. In other words, there's positions that are sounder, more. They're the ones that we should adhere to, and then there are others that it's simply it's just out. It's out. You can't resolve them. You can't come to some conclusion. Even like in the Mukhtasar of Sidi Khalil, he has positions in the madhab where he won't give you a definitive position. He'll just say there's two opinions, and he doesn't decide. It's called tarjih. He doesn't make any tarjih. He doesn't tell you which one is the one you should follow. He just says these are the two opinions. Let me give you one example. In the purification of heart, there was a story that I heard in Morocco. It could be looked at as a silly story. It's a story about a man, on a lion. He's a Zahid. The Zahid is, and he comes down from his mountain and he rides into this town to meet this man who he hears is a saint, and the saint is living in a palace and opulent, and he tells the man to put his lion in with his cow, and he says the cow will get eaten. And he said, don't worry about the cow, just put the lion in with the cow. So he puts it in. And the next day, he's very disappointed with this man because he eats, he goes to sleep. He doesn't see any qualities of zuhud that he has. So he just writes him off as, why do people think this is a good man? And when he goes to get his lion, the cow ate the lion. That's a story. It's just a story. It's a teaching story. It's not a hadith. It's not, somebody can point that out and just say, what is that? It's just a story. That's all it is. And you'll find that in the books. Imam al-Ghazali mentions stories. They're just stories. They're teaching stories. The Quran says that Allah uses parables. He uses similitudes. He uses likenesses. Why? Because they're ways in which people can understand. Some of them are funny. They're really very funny teaching stories out there and things like that. And traditionally, stories were used to teach.
I guess in summary, the purification to release a book in the English language in our times on the subject is also a way of kind of reviving and bringing back a sense of balance in terms of the complete or holistic understanding of the Islamic sciences.
Well, it's a science that I feel we're in particular need of, because we have so many of these problems afflicting our communities, and I really believe they're rooted in our hearts. Do you see? I've met many people who, what I've noted in them is that their arguments have more to do with their own personal pathology than actually the points that they're trying to make. In other words, they're argumentative people. And so they're looking for opportunities to get into arguments. So I'll give you one example. I have some friends that totally disagree with a lot of my views about Islam. But they're friends. I'm not making that up. I have a friend, he's a professor in Medina University in Saudi Arabia. And when I go to Medina, I usually visit him. He teaches usul. And he doesn't agree with some of the things that I was taught. But it's never, ever been a reason for me not to like him and him not to like me. Ever. It's never been, he'll bring it up, he kind of nudges, and when certain topics come up, and he'll smile about it. Because he respects, even though he knows that opinion he disagrees with, he still recognizes that it's a scholastic position, it's a position within the ummah. I don't think it's the right one, but I know that a lot of ulama adhere to it, and that's why I'm not going to make it an issue for hating this person or seeing this person as outside of the scope of friendship. And I think that there are other people, though, that's not how I find them. I find that they're entrenched in positions that do not enable them to actually just be human. Just sit down, have a cup of tea. Let's just speak as human beings. I'm a convert to Islam. I converted to Islam. I was a Christian before, and you'll sit down and have a talk with me as a Christian, and you're a Muslim, because I'm not in some way threatening to your whatever you believe about Islam. But because you disagree with me about Islam, you won't, even though we both say La ilaha illallah, we believe there's no God but the one true God, Allah, and we believe that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger. That's how close we are. Because according to the hadith on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that's the biggest thing you have. And that's how close we are. And then we believe in the same book, It's not difference of opinion. It's not King James version as opposed to this version or that version. We believe in the same book. We read the same book. When I recite my Maghrib, I could be reciting the same surah as you're reciting. And I pray the same number of rakat. It's amazing. But if I wiggle my finger in my tashahhud, and you're going to make that an issue, or if I don't wiggle my finger, I mean, my God, we have a very serious problem. We have a really serious problem. Do you see? And that's my point, is that, unfortunately, much of what's going on is that people are finding ways to manifest their own pathologies within a framework of justification. In other words, I'm going to use this religion, and this isn't really a conscious thing, which is why I do have some sympathy, because I've been deluded myself, and I might still be deluded about certain things. I mean, that's the thing about delusion. You don't know you're deluded. So I know that I'll give you one example. When I was in my early 20s studying in the Emirates, I refused to speak English. And I refused to speak English with Arabs because I read a book by Ibn Taymiyyah, because I had a roommate who was a student of Nasiruddin al-Albani, the muhaddith from Syria. And he's originally Albanian. But, he had a lot of these books, and I read this book by Ibn Taymiyyah, اقتضاء الصراط المستقيم في مخالفة أصحاب الجحيم, the necessities of following the straight path in going against what the people of hell do. And a lot of it was an attack on Christianity and Judaism. But what was interesting is there was some hadith in there, and they actually were good hadiths about من يحسن أن يتكلم العربية فلا يتكلم بغيرها فإنه يورث النفاق. That whoever is able to speak Arabic shouldn't speak with other than Arabic, because it will cause hypocrisy to grow in his heart. Well, I took that hadith literally, and I refused to speak English. I would tell people if they came in to visit me, sometime they would come, they'd speak to me in English. And my Arabic wasn't that strong when I was first learning. But they would speak to me in English, and I would say, لا يجوز هذا الكلام لا يجوز, this isn't permitted to speak in English. That was my state. And I really thought that was the right thing to be doing. So that's just the thing about life. It's a learning curve, and people grow and expand. And Imam Malik, if you look in his 92 years, his positions changed throughout his life. Imam Shafi'i only lived 54 years, and he's got completely different madhabs. He has madhab al-Iraqi al-Qadim. He's got madhab Masr, the Egyptian madhab, which is a completely different madhab from his madhab in Iraq, because he was growing. So not to allow for growth is really a disservice.
Excellent. Next question would be, we live in a world forever changed by the events of 9/11. How did that day affect you? And did you learn anything from the event, like personally, on a personal level?
For me, I think, if anything, there's no doubt, even though there's been an immense amount of terror in our lifetime, some of it perpetrated by our own country. But if you look at other places like Rwanda, Rwanda is a much more serious event than 9/11. I don't even think you can compare the two. What 9/11, what differs about September of 2001 is that it was a spectacle that has been unparalleled, probably in human history. Nobody, Hiroshima seeing that mushroom was pretty extraordinary, but nobody has ever seen civilian airplanes plow into some of the tallest buildings in the world, explode in an extraordinary display of fireworks, and then watch these extraordinary towers just come tumbling down. It was an event filmed for everybody to see that was just so spectacular from that point of view, that it does have a unique element that is unparalleled. In terms of the actual suffering, in our lifetimes there have been much greater events of human suffering. there's no doubt. And I would say in some ways, certainly Rwanda, certainly Chechnya. I mean, the entire city of Grozny I saw film of that, just what the Russians did, bombed it with plane after plane, an entire city. If you look at Hamburg, what the Allied forces in World War II did to the German cities, razed them to the ground. Some of those Allies, when they came in, they could not believe what was done. Those were crimes against humanity, which that was part of the irony of the Nuremberg trials, is that who was the war criminal? The Germans, the British? I mean, the Holocaust is a horrific event, one of the worst in human history. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of just suffering, there's a lot of suffering going on in the world, in a lot of different places. And for America, it was very profound because it brought home some very powerful messages, and that a lot of people don't like us. Some people have legitimate reasons, but that does not legitimize using illegitimate means to express that dislike or loathing. So, and I think that's where the Muslims have made major mistakes. What's wrong has to be condemned simply as wrong. There's no justification. You cannot justify it. There's no justification. And even though an explanation of why things happen is not necessarily a justification. In other words, like when Columbine happened, a slew of social scientists went in, psychiatrists, to try to work out, why did this happen? I mean, that's important for us to do that in terms of 9/11, which is what some people like Michael Moore and other people, that's what they attempted to do, is just look at it like, why did this happen? Why? I mean, why would people want to do this? So that's important. It doesn't necessarily justify it. But I think that the Muslims, for me, there were many lessons. But I mean, this idea somehow that some Muslims have who are familiar with me, I mean, there are some Muslims that are aware of my work and others that aren't. But the overwhelming majority have never heard of me and probably will never hear of me. But for those people here in the States in particular who are familiar with my work, amongst some of them there was this idea that I made this 180-degree turn. And it's simply not true. It really isn't. And for people that knew me before closely, they were very well aware that it was actually very consistent with what I think and what I believe. So I was thrust into certain situations that I personally don't feel that I was prepared for. I really wasn't. I mean, to use a sports metaphor, it was like somebody in Little League suddenly getting thrust into big leagues and without having any training. And the speed, the speed of the pitch was so much faster because I certainly did not have any media understanding of how manipulative. I mean, I did theoretically, but I'm talking about actually living it, experiencing it, seeing how your words can be mangled and turned around. I hadn't experienced that before as an individual. I'd read about it, I'd heard about people that it happened to, but to actually experience it is very different. And most people, part of empathizing is trying to put yourself in another person's shoes, which we do too little of in the world. It's just trying to imagine being in another person's shoes. What does that mean to be in front of millions of people? What does it mean when CNN's got a camera in your face and they're asking you a question and you're realizing this is going out to millions of people and I have to say what is going to be the most judicious statement that I believe and the least harmful to the Muslims overall. So, I was put into a position that I probably, and I don't say probably, I was certainly neither ready for nor fully cognizant of its import. So that was a major lesson for me, is that people are being paid, these interviewers are being paid several hundreds of thousands of dollars because they're very clever people that when they want something, they know how to get it, they know how to elicit it from you. And if you're not prepared, if you don't know how that game works, you can be abused and manipulated. And that was a lesson. But overall, I think, certain things that in the 90s, particularly the later part, the latter half of the decade of the 90s, from about 96 onward, I was having a lot of introspection about the state of the Muslim community. And you'll see that in talks that I gave in that later portion. I think a good one is the Stations of Gratitude and the Duties of Brotherhood, where I did talk about certain things that were very troubling in the Muslim community, and that was long before 9/11. So when people saw me suddenly, people that didn't follow a lot of my talks or really know what I was all about, they might have seen me once at ISNA or heard me a few times or something, but really didn't follow my thought, because I've been teaching for a long time and I have a lot of material out there, particularly recorded material. Not enough written material, which is part of the problem, because in written material, it's much less difficult to misunderstand. Oral speech is actually very complicated because the grammar is not in the speech, it's in the understanding of the person. You don't see the pyramids, the commas, the semicolons, the dashes, the question marks. There are a lot of nuances in the spoken word that are not picked up. And unfortunately, a lot of Muslims do not have a level of English that enables them to pick up a lot of nuances. There are also people that are not accustomed because a speech is very different from if we're just shooting the breeze, as they say. A speech is very different because you have arguments that are being set up. You have logical transitions. You have premises and conclusions. And if you're not vigilant in listening to a talk, you can completely misunderstand what a speaker is saying because your mind might have wandered for 30 seconds or 60 seconds or a few minutes, and suddenly you didn't hear what that person had prefaced his remarks by. So a lot of misunderstanding occurs, and that's always problematic with language. Now, for me, I think it's probably exacerbated by the fact that I am not a structured speaker. And there's benefits to that, but there's also, the benefits are I'm a more spontaneous speaker, so people sense that. When they hear me talking, it's not coming from a prepared script. It's coming from my heart, and it's what I'm talking to you. People feel that. It's not stale in that way, so a lot of people respond to that. That is a benefit. But the harm that goes with it is that sometimes I say things that I might not have said in the best way. I also might have regretted later because it was spontaneous. Like one of the Arabs said, لَقَدْ قُلْتُ حَقًّا وَلَكِنْ مَا كُلُّ حَقٍّ يُقَالُ. I said what was true, but sometimes not every truth should be said. And also that it can actually be tangential to the point where it does get hard to follow. And that's why, some people who listen to me actually will listen to it more than once. And I've heard many people tell me that. I had to listen to that 3 times before I actually got it. Now, those are my shortcomings. And I've tried to remedy those to the best of my ability, but I lose more than I gain when I've done that in the past. So that's been a problem for me. But I'm very aware of that shortcoming. And I'm very aware that some people have a really hard time listening to me for that reason, because they are more structured in their thinking. So, that's something, it's a problem.
I think that's honestly something that struck me about a lecture that's available on the Zaytuna site, Give and Take for God's Sake, where I thought that was a very strong mix of an outline that seemed to be there, but also that fresh mix of from the heart. A lot of strong responses from that particular talk because of the combination of those 2 elements.
Right.
How important is it for Muslims in the West to develop new art and media as an alternative to what is already out there in the mainstream media?
Well, yeah, being somewhat of a traditionalist, art is a very interesting thing because in tradition, art is something you learn. It's not something you innovate. Your innovation comes within the art. So, for instance, poetry means learning prosody. It means learning how to put... Not everybody has to do it. Some people just have those gifts. But for most people, it means learning how to write the anapes, the dactyl, the iambic, and then tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter. And then once you've learned that, once you've mastered that, that's when your innovation comes. It's how you bring that. Now, in the modern world, most of that is people turn their backs on that. You see, so for instance, classical music is very structured. You have to learn certain things. Once you've learned all those things, then you usually play what's already been written. I mean, there's not very many classical composers. Whereas if you look, for instance, at popular music, for instance, if you're playing country music, I mean, everything's going to be, G, D, C. I mean, there's just this handful of chords that the majority of country music is working in. Or if you go to rock, D, A, E. I mean, you're just working in these kind of basic chord patterns and progressions. And so the talent needed to produce that type of music is insignificant compared to the effort and talent that goes into producing, say, for instance, traditional classical music. So in art form, the same is true of painting. If you're doing abstract painting, abstract painting is you break all the rules. Whereas if you're doing a type of classical painting, which is more mirroring reality as opposed to interpreting reality. So you get the realist school, like Rembrandt. Everything Rembrandt does is very real. You look at it. And one of the things about Rembrandt is he was the first. Why he's so extraordinary is he's one of the first people to put warts on people's faces. I mean, suddenly he was showing people how they really looked instead of having these kind of classical pictures of perfect people. So art is a very interesting thing because it's obviously humans are artists. We are people that express ourselves. And that's what art is really about. It's about expressing oneself in the best way. And so all of us, by the mere fact that we're talking, we're artists. You see, by the mere fact, because speaking is a creative event. I mean, if I say, my son said to me yesterday, we were sitting, and he's 12 years old, and he asked me about something, and then I said, oh, well, it's only up to that point. And he said, oh, it's no more and no less. That was the word he used, the phrase he used. It's no more and no less. And I said, right, no more and no less. And there was a Syrian man there who just looked at me smiling, mashallah, because it was a use of an eloquent phrase. He didn't have to say that, but he embellished it, and it wasn't really intentional. It was just simply the words that came to his mind. So that's a type of expression. Now he's memorized a lot of poetry, so he's got some motifs that he's working with when he speaks. So he'll come up with very interesting syntactical structures when he speaks that I've noted. So we're all artists in that way, that we are expressing ourselves. There are people that the way they dress, the way they walk, the way they write. But what the artist, in other words, the person that is engaged at the deepest level in that activity, what that person is doing is he is consciously expressing himself. In other words, it's a much more conscious effort and experience. And that's why what we recognize when we recognize the artist is that he's speaking for us. And what happens is artist's taste is how close that artist is coming to expressing your own experience of the world or your own feelings. So if I read a Frost poem, you might not like it. but it might speak to me. If you read a Shakespearean sonnet, you might not like it, but it might speak to me. It might speak to both of us. Some poems are universal. They're just so powerful. Almost everybody that hears them is moved by them at some level. So the artist then he is speaking on behalf of others. He is expressing what others are feeling. And that's why the sha'ir in Arabic is the one who feels. Sha'ara means to feel. So the sha'ir is the one who's feeling things and expressing them for others. And so it's very important that the Muslims have people that do that. Historically, Muslims were great artists. And our art, the Islamic art, is some of the most profound, if not, I would argue that Islamic art is the most profound art. Certainly in architecture, certainly in calligraphy, and in many other things. I would argue that the Islamic clothes are some of the most extraordinary clothes. The embroidery patterns, the types of textiles that were manufactured in the Muslim lands. Gauze is from the Muslim world. It's an Arabic word. Qaz, gauze, lace, and all these things. So I think it is important that we do that.
What are the short and long-term strategies that Muslims need to deploy in order to bring back any sensibility to our approach as an Adamic community in the 21st century?
Well, I think it's very important that the Muslims see themselves within the context of the greater human family, that we are all Banu Adam. And Banu Adam is a family. Banu Adam means the tribe of Adam. So we're all in the same tribe. We're just from different clans. We believe that Islam is the Adamic nature, but people deviate from it. Now, part of the problem, I perceive, one of the major problems, is that the Muslims believe now, even though if you really press them, they'll have to admit this isn't true, but they believe it, that they are Muslim. And the problem is that indeed we're Muslim as a sociological category. In other words, when you categorize people out there, you have Jews, Christians, atheists, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims. That's a sociological category of people. But Allah says, Hal antum muslimun. Are you Muslims? He's talking to the Muslims. That's a question in the Quran. Are you in a state of submission? Bal man aslama wajhahu lillah. The one who has submitted his entire being to God. See, that aspect of Islam is completely lacking. And what happens is because we conflate the sociological category of Islam with the spiritual state of Islam, what happens is we fall into the pitfall of spiritual pride. And we begin to see ourselves as better than other people, when in fact they may be better than us because some of them just might be ignorant. They don't even know that Islam is a revelation from God. And that's why when Islam came to me, I really thought, this is true. Even though I was raised a Christian, I thought, this is true. And so I had to become Muslim. Now, when I became Muslim, what I was really trying to do was enter into a state of submission. That's what I wanted. I wanted to be a submitter. I didn't think I was joining a tribe, Bani Islam, and then I have to be with the tribe, right or wrong. My tribe, right or wrong. Like Bani America, they say my tribe, right or wrong. My country, right or wrong. Love it or leave it. That's tribal. That's not truthful. And so that's where I have a real serious problem, is that people expect me to be a spokesman for the tribe. And I can't do that. Because if the tribe's wrong, and I'm a spokesman for the truth, I have to say, the tribe's wrong. Even against yourselves. That's what Allah says. وَلَوْ عَلَى أَنفُسِكُمْ. And I think we need people to do that, and we need more of them. Because I really think we need to look at ourselves. And that is not to say that what's going on, there's so much there are so many terrible things being done to the Muslims. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is, that's been going on for a long time. And the strategies we've been using so far have done nothing to alleviate that. So I'm just wondering, maybe we should reassess. Maybe we should actually try to develop new strategies for changing our condition. And I think one of the first and most important is to reflect on the fact that the Quran says, when you were afflicted with calamities, you asked, why is all this happening to us? قُلْ هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ أَنفُسِكُمْ. Say it's from your own selves. That's one thing. Another thing, مَنْ وَجَدَ خَيْرًا فَلْيَحْمِدِ اللَّهِ. Whoever finds good, let him praise Allah. But whoever finds other than good, let him only blame himself. That's in Arba'un Nawawiyah. So, it's right there. You tell me. I mean, do we take that seriously? Does that mean what it says? I was once in Folsom Prison, and there was a sign. We were in the mess hall. It was for Eid. And there was a sign that said, warning shots will not be fired. And I looked up, and I turned to this man. He was in prison, Muslim man next to me. I said, what does that mean? And he looked at me, and he said, it means exactly what it says. Do you see? Because sometimes you read something, and what does that mean? So when the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever finds good, let him thank Allah. And whoever finds other than that, let him only blame himself. What does that mean? It means exactly what it says. So just do it. Stop trying to philosophize yourself into a corner with God. Submit. Let the tears fall. Show some contrition. I mean, I think we as Muslims, we should be walking around bowing our heads in contrition and begging the non-Muslims to forgive us for being obstacles to seeing the beauty of Islam. I mean, I'm serious. I feel like we should be going up. People say, these people, what did they do to deserve our presentation of Islam to them? When if you look at the Prophet ﷺ, he was patient with people persecuting him, throwing things at him, spitting on him, throwing stones at him for 23 years, and then when a few of them actually finally come to it, Abu Sufyan, after 20 years, his wife, who ate the liver of his uncle, bit into it and spit it out. Wahshi, who threw the spear from behind his back in treachery and killed him, and the Prophet ﷺ gave shahada to all three of them, sat with them in the same room. He couldn't even look at Wahshi, but he sat with him. You tell me, where is that understanding of Islam? Because I want to see it. Where is that? 20 years of persecution, and he's still saying, welcome into the fold. Because he wanted good for people. And Imam Nawawi, in his sharh, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. Imam Nawawi says in his commentary, and I have two versions of it, one, a more recent one from Lebanon, they removed this whole thing from his original commentary because it's politically, they don't want it. They don't want this understanding. He said, وَالْأَوْلَى أَنْ يُحْمَلْ عَلَى عُمُومِ الْأُخُوَّةِ. This should be interpreted first and foremost as universal brotherhood. In other words, the Muslim should love for his brother the kafir and his brother the Muslim what he loves for himself. And then listen to what he says. He says, and this love is spiritual love, not human love, because humans do not desire good for their enemies. They desire harm, and they desire to discriminate against people who are not like them. And therefore, spiritual love, which transcends human love, is for the sake of God. You're going against your nature for the sake of God. And that is why he said it is mustahab. It is not only rewarding with God, but highly encouraged to pray for your enemies. And he said, therefore, a man should go against his soul and pray for those who harm him. Where's that understanding? You see? Where is that? I mean, I'm serious. Why is that in our books? Why is that Imam Nawawi? I mean, are you going to tell me that he didn't understand the hadith? That he didn't know the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what he meant? Seriously. But that goes against your nature. That's what he's saying. You desire harm for your enemies. But if you recognize that your enemies are just a test from God for you, and the point is to guide them, that doesn't mean you don't fight them if they're fighting you. I mean, that's not what it said. But don't fight them with a hatred that you don't want them to be guided. Fight them to remove the blinders from their eyes, to remove the veils on them. And that's why when you conquer them, you forgive them and show them largesse. And that's when they become Muslim. I mean, that's what happened when the Prophet ﷺ marched into Mecca. He forgave them, and they became Muslim because they couldn't understand it. He's going against... That's the power of Jesus. Because those early Christians, they were being eaten by lions, and they were praying for their enemies. People couldn't take it because they were superhuman. They were going against human nature, and they were invoking angelic nature. People forget that. I mean, why did Christianity spread? It conquered the Romans. Why? The Romans had conquered the Christians. They ruled the Christians. Why? How is it that the conquered people conquered the conquerors? How? Because of morals, their moral state, and because of the fact that they didn't allow the fact that they were being persecuted and defeated by them to destroy their hearts and cause them to lose their humanity. And that's why when the Mongols came in and destroyed 2 million Muslims killed, 2 million Muslims, and Hulagu's brother Ahmed became a Muslim within 2 years of the conquest of Baghdad. I mean, that'd be like Jeb Bush today becoming Muslim. You know, that's what it would be like. It'd be like Jeb Bush. And that's not impossible. Don't think that's impossible. If you think that's impossible, I don't think you believe in God. Because he's a human being. He's facing his mortality just like everybody else. And if he reads a sound version of the Quran, if he hears somebody speaking the truth and realizing, my God, this could be another prophet, like Jesus, like Moses, because they're all brothers.
Moving to the next question. You have said that we are living in trying yet interesting times, and that the age we're in is either birth pains or death throes. Can you please tell us more about what you mean by this and your views on the nature of this age?
Well, what I meant by that statement is that on the one hand, if we look on the one hand, it looks like we're this end game. It looks like it's coming down. They're telling us 85% of the fish that we eat is gone. It's just gone. That we've overfished all these areas in these great oceans that Allah provides for us. They're telling us the polar ice caps are melting. They're telling us that the water is rising. Right? That our major cities have such high rates of pollution that it's not safe on some days in Mexico City or Tokyo to go out for children because they'll get asthmatic attacks. In 1945, 1 out of 16 Americans got cancer. Today it's 1 out of 3. So what's going on? AIDS is 50 million people so far have died from AIDS. 50 million. You're talking about the plague of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages took 25 million people. We're already double the number with AIDS. AIDS isn't a plague. It's not a plague on humanity. So on the one hand, if you look out there, it looks grim. It's high water everywhere. I mean, the flood has come. The dam has broke. And that's what the death throes. It looks like we're in our death throes. On the other hand, if you look out there, it looks like we're on the birth pangs of an extraordinary renaissance. So it is interesting. They're trying times, but they're interesting times. And I really mean that. For the first time in human history, racism is seen by the majority of humanity as a blight. Even though we're still suffering from racism all over the world, it is no longer an accepted idea. It is rejected by all thinking people across the board in much larger numbers than has ever existed in human history. 71% of Americans in a recent poll said that they not only were not opposed to mixed marriages, but would not be troubled if their own children married outside of their own race. I mean, that is amazing. And it's happening, and we're seeing it in my children. My children they're brown. When we get together at family reunions, my mother and father's generation, we had an entirely white family. Now there are more mixed children in our family reunions than there are white children. So what's going on? And that's not anomalous. That is actually becoming increasingly a norm. That in 50 years, 50% of America is going to be brown, not white. This is no longer a white country. It's no longer also increasingly so, it is becoming less and less a Christian country. So we have also the possibility of the plurality of races and religions in conviviality, which is extraordinary. For the first time in human history, people are not being persecuted for proselytizing. I mean, all over the world, people couldn't think. They weren't allowed to think. Now you can actually, you can choose your religion. People can choose their religion. I chose to become a Muslim. And this is the first time in human history that you've had that type of freedom of choice in culture. There was a time when I would have been burnt at the stake for becoming a Muslim. Burnt at the stake. So that is an extraordinary, there are many, many extraordinary aspects to the modern society that we have to recognize. The tools that we have now to illuminate people, unfortunately, they're largely being used for endarkment, not for illumination, but rather the opposite. But they're there, and they could be used, and potentially they're immense. I mean, even though, there were many things that troubled me about Fahrenheit 9/11, just from a Islamic point of view of how we engage people we disagree with. I still think it's a very profound event that a film like that has grossed over $100 million, and it's only been out for a few weeks. It's going to be one of the largest grossing films in history, and it's a documentary telling people that we did something that was really wrong. It's just wrong. So I think I think there are many reasons why we should be optimistic. So this is the paradox of our age. It's an age that, on the one hand, it really looks like we're dying. On the other hand, it looks like we've hardly been born.
That brings us to the last question from Deenport. Many Muslims are suffering today. The Ummah seems to be in a state of helplessness. What can we do as individuals to make positive changes? And also, what are the pros and cons of working as individuals for this change as opposed to in groups?
Well, Bismillah, the first thing that I would say is about that is that our helplessness is a gift from God. Because we have to see that it's from God. God has removed our power, partly because we started thinking that it was our power and not God's power. So it's a gift from God. I don't think we should see our condition as anything other than an opportunity from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to truly submit. Because the world is so beyond. It's like Robert McNamara said, one of the lessons that he learned, and this is the man who was in charge of the Vietnam War, who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the lessons that he learned was rationality will not save us. Because he said Kennedy was rational, Khrushchev was rational, Castro was rational, and yet they brought us to the brink of destruction. Rational men. Rationality will not save us. So that's a lesson. And if that's Robert McNamara saying that, I mean, shouldn't Muslims learn that lesson? Because that's an Islamic lesson. Rationality will not save us. Nothing we can do will save us. Nothing. We cannot do anything that will save us. It is Allah alone, our Creator alone, that can save us. And that's why we have to call on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the only thing that we can do. Like one of the poets, Muslim poets, he said, I bring you something, God, that even you don't possess. My impoverishment. That's the only thing I can bring to you that you don't possess. Everything else you have. But that's the one thing I can bring you that is uniquely my own to give you. Because I can't bring you my strength. You've got that and it cancels mine out. I can't bring you my intelligence. You have that and it cancels mine out. I can't bring you anything. I can't bring you my wealth. You've got that and it cancels mine out. But the one thing I can bring you is my helplessness, my impoverishment, because you don't have that. That's the one gift we can give to God that is uniquely our own to give, and that's why it's a great gift from Allah, helplessness. But we have to see it as that. In terms of working in groups or not groups working, I mean, I would say that Allah is with the jama'ah. Yadullahi ma'al jama'ah. That's a good hadith. So it's important that we work together at the best of our ability. I mean, there's some people that will never be able to work with groups. There's personalities that's just, and those people should find the best way that they can do that. And that's there's a chapter in the Riyadh al-Salihin, removing oneself from people to protect them from his harm. So there's certain people that they'll sabotage everything they get into. They can't help themselves. So if that's your state, then just don't block other people from doing good work.
Well, we thank you for your time and your answer.
Alhamdulillah.
For the
Subhanallah.